a child.
Okay, let's play some damn
instant
shit.
death sentence. And in some places you might be right, but not everywhere. The key thing about finding out a person has one of these no-good crimes on their record is that they instantly fall to the bottom of that social hierarchy, which makes them an easy target. Nobody, and I mean nobody,
street
is going
whore,
to stick their neck out to help a convicted offender. Least of all,
shut the
because
damn
doing
game.
so might be seen by others as tolerance towards them. In any case, we'll start with a violent, visible and visceral example of what can happen to these kind of inmates once they're locked up. Yes, it's true that offenders can be, and sometimes are, targeted in brutal attacks. Some can be attacked pretty much on site, if particular details of their case ever found their way into certain inmates' hands. These guys are often driven off the yard.
I ain't talking Joseph Stalin either, I'm talking about Stalin!
Simply don't tolerate having those kinds of prisoners out and about, and the inmates enforce that policy through violence. Sometimes, gangs who check the paperwork of inmates when they enter a prison will then put pressure on their new cellmates to do something about them, or otherwise risk looking like they condone crimes. And when it comes to prison, a lot of assaults are more than your average beatdown. A hard object, like a padlock, or a rock housed in a sock can make a devastating blunt force weapon. Meanwhile, shivs, clubs and shanks can be made out of almost anything. Heavy objects can be dropped onto inmates from a height, they can be beaten down in camera blind spots, or have disgusting liquids thrown over them. Particularly popular in some facilities is the use of, quote, prison napalm. This delightful concoction starts with water, which is boiled either with sugar or a candy bar in it, and then thrown over the target. The sticky contents means it clings to the skin, whilst causing severe burns all over the body. And of course, if all else fails, anything within a cell can be turned into a weapon by bashing a person's head into it. Why an inmate would be attacked might seem obvious, but clearly a universal disdain towards this kind of person doesn't equate to instant violence in every prison. So what causes someone to go after a offender in this way? Of course, as we mentioned, it could be to get them off the yard. If the guards see that a person is being targeted, they will remove someone from the unit so as not to cause more violence in general. So, attacking someone could be a way to get in with a prison gang. It could also be a form of kind of rough justice for the crimes. In general, prison sentences for offenders aren't often seen as sufficient due to short sentencing guidelines. So, by attacking the offender in prison, you're kind of making up for where the justice system was perceived to have failed. It could also be someone bragging about what they've done, or it could simply be someone trying to gain notoriety. Margaret Bach, a spokeswoman for the California Department of Corrections, stated as such after the killing of notorious pedophile and former Catholic priest John Gergen, quoting here, "If you take out an offender like this former priest in Massachusetts, maybe the person who took him out thought he'd make a name for himself. Gergen's killer, a man named Joseph Druce, took him out. If you take out an offender like this former priest in Massachusetts, maybe the person who took him out thought he'd make a name for himself." Gergen's killer, a man named Joseph Druce, stated that he looked upon Gergen as a prize and plotted his murder for a month beforehand. In many ways, attacking a notorious offender like this is seen by inmates as a victimless crime. After all, who cares if this offender gets killed? Especially for those who are never have nothing left to lose. They may see killing a serial offender as a net good for the world, and their actions as an example of kind of taking one for the team. At the same time, they gain status and a sense of moral superiority, and the taxpayer doesn't have to pay for their incarceration anymore. You could make the argument that everybody wins, and lots of people do make that point. There is still the offender,
except the goddamn
big time, as well as his or her family, who likely still care about them, but many will feel that this doesn't really matter. All of that, of course, is on top of all the other random harms that could be caused by something else entirely. Taking someone's stuff, accumulating debts, disrespecting a gang member, or someone suffering with mental health problems, snapping in a violent matter. The guards don't help in a lot of prisons in this respect. They're people too, and might have a similar sentiment to wanting to see such offenders brutalised for what they've done. Some guards might leave doors open, or look the other way whilst a brazen attack is carried out, allowing for them to plead ignorance and plausible deniability, and writing off such actions as simple accidental mistakes. Some might be, many are not. Regardless, even with the guards sometimes written against them, there isn't much sympathy for those on this rung of the ladder whenever bad things happen to them. For example, Richard Huckle was considered one of Britain's most prolific child sex offenders. He was just 3 years into a life sentence when he was stabbed and killed by another inmate.
One of Britain's worst has been stabbed to death in prison. Richard Huckle, who was in Kent, has been jailed for abusing up to 200 children overseas. He was found dead in his cell at HMP Full Sutton in Yorkshire yesterday. Our Home Affairs correspondent Sarah Corker reports.
He had spent 9 years abusing children and babies in both Malaysia and Cambodia, pleading guilty to no less than 71 offences. More examples would be the likes of John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and Judge Fogel, all who were attacked. Dahmer was even killed when he was attacked in 1994. All of their crimes included those committed against young people, and Dahmer's in particular wrapped in his twisted motivations. Gacy wasn't much better, whilst Fogel had status as a celebrity prior to his crimes being revealed. But the thing is, a violent beating, or being threatened, is pretty par for the course in a lot of prisons. Eventually, someone will either be beaten off the yard, or they'll check themselves in for protection. But there are much worse fates for the average offender than just getting beaten up. Of course, getting killed is possible, but it's often rarer than other darker outcomes. One more common result is coercion or extortion. Offender in prison may buy his protection through providing the right people with items from the prison commissary. Some inmates might even be able to arrange money to be wired to an individual's account or to their families. If offender is famous, or otherwise known to be wealthy, this can continue in perpetuity, where offender becomes little more than a piggy bank, doling out money under the threat of violence if they didn't. Coercion, however, doesn't have to be just financial in nature. Offender could be used to complete various labour tasks and jobs for protection, basically like a slave who is paid by not getting hit in the face. They might be pushed into other crimes within the prison, like helping with smuggling operations or hiding contraband in their cells. They could also be used to pass notes, drugs, or weapons between areas of the prison, or even act as lookouts, really anything that the exploiting party wants. The only consistent factor being the protection of the individual from wider harm, just at a cost. And that cost can be even greater still, as some offenders are extorted and forced into performing acts on other prisoners for a form of protection. Of course, some inmates deliberately and violently target offender inmates in this way as well, as if to dull out a sense of vigilante justice, to put them through what they themselves had done to others. There is always the option of becoming a prison wife for protection. It is a truly miserable existence founded in pain, fear, violence, and control. But for some, even this hell is preferable to the alternative, which is widespread ostracization and isolation from the rest of the prison population. If someone is beaten off the yard, they are put in protective custody, which is a double-edged sword. An individual will be somewhat safer there, but it comes at the cost of a staggering amount of human interaction. Humans are social beings. We're designed to want to converse and mix with others. And even in prison, that feeling is still there. But many units don't permit offenders such a luxury. Many inmates want nothing to do with those who are considered even greater scumbags than them, and the result is a social pariah status. They experience something akin to total identity collapse after being rejected by everything and everyone. They simply become their crime and nothing more, in a way that not many other prisoners experience. It's, as you can imagine, isolating and lonely. Some might see being left alone as the ultimate win within prison, but it doesn't quite work that way. Even in protective custody, people are subject to the risks of everyday prison life, and offenders face the added cost of spending potentially years of it without significant social interaction. It leads to a quiet, monotonous existence free from the vanishingly few perks that exist inside, only punctured by moments of extreme fear and violence. Isolation in prison is associated with a variety of mental health issues and unhealthy behaviours. Again, there's no real sympathy or love for those in that position, but it just goes to show how much harder it can be for those who commit the darkest crimes. So then, what can an inmate do to mitigate their status inside prison? What few strategies offenders use to make life more bearable on the inside? Well, it's a mix. As we mentioned, they can always check in to protective custody, as known as solitary confinement, or the special housing unit. Some make this choice and others have it made for them. The isolation, of course, offers some protection, but as we said, it comes at the cost of the individual's mental health. Some have no issues being isolated like this because they understand the alternative or just seem to manage better in their own company. But there are, of course, risks, both physical and psychological, regardless. Another option is gang protection. Again, many prison gangs, especially in the US, are based around race, and even amongst the lowest of the low, there is some level of protection, at least from other gangs. Offenders in that environment will only be targeted if their gang's shot caller gives the okay. It's certainly possible for a person to be attacked despite this, but in general it does slim down the chances of a random act of brutal violence. Another option is for those individuals to band together as strength in numbers can put off single attackers. It also helps with the isolation, as offenders then find a group with each other. Depending on the prison, some yards have a large number of offenders, and so the prison culture begrudgingly accepts them, resulting in the violence towards them becoming less widespread. A more drastic solution from the prison management side is to create whole wings mostly dedicated to offenders. When these offenders aren't just a minority, but a plurality or even a majority of inmates, violence towards them obviously decreases. With the amount that these guys check themselves in or have to isolate themselves, it makes sense then to just give them their own wing. There's a real tension here though between them and the non-offender prisoners who then have to exist in their wing might be afraid of being lumped in with the real ex-offenders. Having such units within prisons makes them a target, like in the New Mexico riot we mentioned in the intro, and there's no limit to the creativity of cruelty that some may try to inflict on them. Often, guards or upper prison management has to threaten strict crackdowns and increased times on sentences to get many to fall in line. Of course, though this has little effect on those who believe they've got nothing left to lose, like lifers. What else? Well, if this kind of offender is really lucky, they might even be sent to an entire prison dedicated to offenders. These are called SOMPs, or offender management programs. Now, these programs can take place in any prison where there are lots of offenders, but increasingly, the thought has been to have dedicated institutions for such offenders altogether to entirely eliminate the risk of reprisal-based violence. They help create a more secure environment for offenders, which reduces the need for protective custody or special housing units in regular prisons, which makes space for more violent inmates. Such institutions aren't overly new, they're just not all that common. Take HMP Wotton, for example, in the British city of Nottingham. It was built in the 60s, but the prison has been dedicated to offender management since the early 1990s. Wotton holds roughly 800 inmates, and all of them offenders. 70% of those who are incarcerated here have committed offences against children. The prison's local nickname is the Pedo Palace. But of course, they too come with their own downsides. They're not popular, as you can tell by HMP Wotton's nickname, and so there's not a lot of political will to protect what most in society see as the lowest of the low. So, whilst such programs appear to work, nobody's exactly gagging to build offender prison in their local area for obvious reasons. In general, these prisons are believed to help offenders prepare for life back on the outside. Whether you agree or don't, sentencing guidelines mandate an immediate life sentence for offenders in most places, which means they will be released back into society at some point. And even if you have no sympathy for them, it's better for those capable of committing such crimes to not be violently institutionalized, and instead for them to at least try and be rehabilitated, as the other option leads to patterns of reoffending, which only punishes society and creates more victims. It makes sense, then, for the betterment of the public safety for such institutions to exist. But remember, most prisons aren't like this. Most offenders in prison live an isolated, violent, and miserable life. And even though many weren't sentenced to life, they end up never leaving. Some will call it a mercy, others a net positive on the world, and some will just call it the natural order of things. One thing is for certain, even at the bottom of the ladder, it shows there is always further a person can fall.
God fucking damn it. God bucket. God bucket.
Mexican cartels don't just practice torture, they perfect it. For them, cruelty is calculated, a method designed to push victims beyond their breaking point, from unleashing tigers to chili pepper in wounds, and even turning something as innocent as a vase of flowers into a weapon of pain. Cartels have mastered the art of suffering, but just how far will they go? On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're exposing the cartel tortures so extreme, they are worse than death. Number 10. We'll start off on easy mode, which for cartels is still brutal. Fear. When they're not busy mutilating their victims, they're driving them mad with more abstract forms of cruelty and terror. A lot of the time, this involves making them think their loved ones are about to die horrific
She's
deaths.
cute. Oh, that woman is cute.
Muzzle flashes lit up the night as bullets ricocheted off rusted shipping containers in an old Mexican port facility. El Marino Loco crouched low, his silhouette ghost-like in the darkness. His team of Mexican federal agents put down suppressive fire, pinning the cartel traffickers behind a barricade of crates loaded with contraband. "He's here!" The words came from somewhere in the shadows. Whispers spread like wildfire among the traffickers, laced with panic. The chief trafficker's voice trembled as he signaled his men to stop firing. An unnatural silence followed, broken only by the distant crash of waves against the dock. One by one, El Marino's men vanished into the shadows. The trafficker glanced around, his breath shallow and erratic. The stillness was suffocating. Sweat beaded on his brow. Fear had gripped him. Then everything changed in an instant. A blur of motion from behind. A flash of steel glinting faintly in the moonlight. The crowbar came down hard. The sharp crack of metal meeting bone echoed through the port. The boss staggered, his world spinning violently, before crumbling to the ground. Before he could scream, he was swallowed by the darkness. Several months later, in a dingy safe house across town, the traffickers' phones buzzed simultaneously. A photo message lit their screens. Their boss, stripped of dignity, sitting cuffed in garish red lingerie, flanked by grinning federal agents. Another ping. The text bore only 5 words. "You're next. El Marino Loco." It wasn't just a rumor, it was his signature move. This was El Marino Loco, a shadow, a hunter, a legend in Mexico's brutal cartel war. Join us today to hear his story on today's episode of The Infographic Show. It was past midnight when Eric Morales Guevara, better known as El Marino Loco, stalked to the streets of Tampico. The faint hum of a helicopter's rotor blades overhead signaled the Navy's presence. Morales moved with precision, his tactical gear blending into the darkness. Tonight's target was Sylvester Haro Rodriguez, alias El Chive, a notorious leader of the Gulf Cartel. Morales' intel suggested that El Chive was holed up in a heavily fortified compound, surrounded by armed guards and a maze of security measures. As the team breached the compound, chaos erupted. Gunfire erupted in the courtyard as El Chive's men scrambled to defend their boss. Morales' voice cut through the din, barking orders as his team swept through a series of rooms. Within minutes, El Chive was cornered, a mix of fear and fury etched in his face. But it wasn't the arrest that would make the headlines. Morales walked into the cartel leader's personal quarters and spotted an urn on the mantel, the ashes of El Chive's late father. With cold, calculated malice, Morales knocked the urn to the ground, scattering its contents across the floor. He turned to a family photograph from the wall, scrawled a crude drawing of women's clothing over it. The psychological blow was as deliberate as the rated. Word of the humiliation spread quickly. El Chive, enraged, put a price on Morales' head, 3 million pesos. But for El Marino Loco, this was just another night in the war against the cartels. The Mexican drug war of the 2010s was a descent into chaos, a time when entire cities became killing fields and human life was reduced to a grim statistic. In Durango, the horrors of cartel violence were unearthed in the spring of 2011 when authorities discovered mass graves containing the remains of 145 people. These graves were not hidden in the dense wilderness, but scattered around the city, a chilling testament to the impunity with which the cartels operated. The victims were men, women, and even children, many of whom bore the signs of torture. Their stories would remain untold, their lives swept away in a war where silencing the opposition, whether rival gang members or innocent civilians, had become as routine as the setting sun. This discovery shocked the nation, but it was just one of many atrocities that defined this blood-stained chapter of Mexico's history. Elsewhere, in the border city of Nuevo Laredo, the drug war was brutally playing out in an unrelenting cycle of violence. In 2012, 23 people were killed in a single 24-hour period. Their bodies left as warnings to anyone who dared challenge the cartels. Some were hanged from the bridges, their corpses displayed like grotesque trophies. These acts were designed to strike fear into the hearts of law enforcement and civilians alike. But Nuevo Laredo was no exception. It was merely another battlefield in a larger war. That same year, the rural town of Ruiz Nayarit witnessed its own bloodbath when a convoy from Los Zetas ambushed and killed 29 members of the rival Sinaloa cartel. The ambush was ruthless and methodical, a demonstration of the cartel's military-style tactics and their capacity to wage a war on an industrial scale. By the end of President Felipe Calderon's term in 2012, the official death toll had reached at least 60,000. Yet these numbers were only a part of the story. Independent estimates put the figure at over 120,000 by 2013, with an additional 27,000 people classified as missing, their fates unknown. Entire communities were torn apart by kidnappings, extortion, and forced disappearances. In towns like Jilotan de los Dolores, clashes between federal police and cartel groups like Familia Michoacana often left double-digit death tolls, with little distinction made between combatants and bystanders. Families lived in fear of violence erupting at any moment. Children grew up in neighborhoods where murder was a daily occurrence, and corruption eroded trust in the very institutions tasked with was a daily occurrence. And corruption eroded trust. Children grew up in neighborhoods where murder was a daily occurrence, and corruption eroded trust in the very institutions tasked with protecting them. The war's death toll wasn't just a number, it was a measure of the soul-crushing despair that engulfed the nation under siege. Amid this chaos emerged a shadowy figure, El Marino Loco. His reputation wasn't just built on the drug lords he took down, but on the public humiliations he made them endure. Eric Morales Guevara was born on October 9, 1982, in Reynosa, Tamaulipas. From the moment he opened his eyes, it was clear that life in Tierra Caliente would be a crucible of survival. Cartel violence didn't hide in the shadows. It played out in the open, in broad daylight. Murders, kidnappings, and executions were everyday occurrences. The cartels ruled with absolute control, deciding everything. From the movies shown in the local theaters to its businesses corporate. Morales grew up watching his neighbors, even his family friends, fall victim to cartel violence. His father and mother, however, were determined to shield him from the violence. They instilled in him a strong sense of right and wrong, emphasizing the importance of education and hard work. Morales had been protected by his father, kept safe from the cartel's violence, but everything changed the day a cartel foot soldier got into a fight with his father and killed him. That moment didn't just scar Morales, it shaped the man he would become. Years later, Morales confided in a friend, "I will never forget that day, the day he took my father's life. Since then I promised that every damn criminal I caught, they would burn in my hands." Driven by this vow, Morales enlisted in the Mexican Navy and Marines as soon as he was of age. The training was grueling, but Morales excelled, graduating with distinction. Over time, he climbed the ranks, learning advanced tactical skills and earning a place in the Fuerzas Especiales, or FES, Mexico's elite special forces unit. The FES was a breed apart, tasked with high-risk operations against cartels, terrorists, and other threats to national security. Morales honed his expertise in urban warfare, reconnaissance, and psychological operations. His time in the FES solidified his reputation as a soldier willing to do whatever it took to achieve his mission, a trait that would define his career. Mexico's drug war exploded in 2006 when President Felipe Calderón deployed the military to combat the cartels. What followed was a decade of unprecedented violence. By 2010, Tamaulipas and Nuevo León were among the most dangerous states, with cartel violence spilling into every facet of life. Eric Morales Guevara's journey to becoming El Marino Loco began in an unexpected setting. The officers and captain's casino of the 1st Naval Zone in Tamaulipas. That's where he worked as a dishwasher. At the time, Morales was just a young recruit working to prove himself while enduring the notoriously harsh demands of the Mexican Navy. The days were grueling, the work unremarkable, until the night that changed everything. A visibly intoxicated and belligerent lieutenant stumbled into the kitchen and, for reasons known only to him, targeted Morales with a stream of slurred insults. Morales, ever the professional, tried to defuse the situation, but the lieutenant's temper boiled over. The officer swung a wild punch, and Morales had no choice but to defend himself. With reflexes honed from his military training, Morales grabbed the nearest object, a fork, and lunged at the officer. The attack wasn't fatal, but the wound left the officer screaming in agony, and Morales was dragged away by his stunned peers. The story of the crazy dishwasher who fought back spread like wildfire throughout the naval base, earning Morales a mix of notoriety and grudging respect. When it came time to renew his contract with the Navy, Morales faced an unexpected roadblock. During the mandatory psychological evaluation, he was failed by the attending psychologist, a former friend of the injured lieutenant. The rejection wasn't based on Morales' mental fitness, but on petty retaliation. Rather than wallow in frustration, Morales leaned into the label. Soon, the nickname El Marino Loco was born, at first as a joke, but soon it became a badge of honor. It came to represent his defiance of authority, his unshakable resolve, and his unconventional approach to justice. While the Navy viewed him as eccentric, his peers saw him as a fearless and resourceful fighter, willing to go to any length to protect himself and his comrades. This reputation would follow him into the streets of Tamaulipas, where he would take on an even more fearsome identity. On the streets amongst the criminals, Morales was known by another name, Senor Thor. It wasn't his imposing presence or his reputation for brutality that earned him the nickname. It was a reference to his weapon of choice. While most operatives relied on firearms to enforce the law, in one engagement Morales allegedly wielded a